case. I'll record it just in case. Never know.
Okay.
Okay, so last week you posted a message in Slack saying, hey, Gabe was really interested in our proposal for how we were going to do merge request approval rules to the group level, considering also how we might do the instance level. And someone put together a diagram to help show the logic behind it. I really struggled to put it in a logical like diagram and like a relationship diagram. I just felt like, well, it's kind of simple. You just inherit what's above you, but it depends on who your parent is. So the reason why I was asking for your clarity was I think there is a difference between how we're doing like protected branches and push rules versus merge request approvals. The unique attribute being with merge request approval rules, you can use a compliance framework label. The other things you can't because it's just not how it is today. So I don't feel adequately informed to say one is better than the other. I just understand why using compliance labels gives us more customization.
Mm-hmm.
So it's harder to know if this should be like the thing that gets adopted by every group because I'm still not even sure on it. And so when I walked through the first example, I was trying to show like how it would inherit if there were no labels. And then the second one was if there would be labels. So I'll stop there and I'm going to try and go pull up your comment so I can refer back to your specific points.
Sure. So maybe what would be helpful is for me to back up a little bit and say one of the catalysts for the labels was that conversation with Sid, where we as GitLab do not want to build features that negatively impact the developer experience on a very broad level. Which is in direct conflict with what enterprise customers want, which is to impact the experience on a very broad. Well, that's not fair. That's not what they want. What they want is the ability to control how their users operate, which in many cases means negatively impacting the user experience because they're introducing added layers of control, right? Like this many approvers and you can't change this setting. And so that inherently is at conflict with a good UX, I think. So the reason the labels made sense was we could add this delineation attribute to projects and maybe groups to be able to refine that scope. But that, of course, isn't the only way to do it, I'm sure. And maybe there's a different way to leverage them that still achieves the same outcome. So that's a little bit more background on it, but if that's helpful.
Yeah, I think it does help set the context. I think the challenge then comes in when we talk about things like actually using the labels. With the way that we have it currently designed, you can only apply the same rules for one or many labels. You can't have different rules for SOX and different rules for HIPAA.
Right.
I think that's why I'm saying like I don't know if they're the best option because they are limiting in that way. Am I trying to solve for a problem that may not exist? Possibly, which is why maybe I'm thinking too deeply about it. So I think your like intuition is leading you towards we should still work towards the example where we're introducing rules that use labels as a way to percolate down inheritance. And then the second thing you brought up was okay, if you disallow changes and set its approvers to, don't think it should change everything to, okay.
Well, let me throw a wrench in this real quick.
Okay, yay.
Because I was thinking about this, and as we talk, it sounds maybe more like a more simple approach potentially. So for the sake of bringing things up to group and instance level, for the sake of standardization and automation, ignore enforcement for a second. We can get rid of the label concept and say, we're going to add this to the group level, and we'll give you control on how and where this inherits down to, but we won't give you the ability to enforce that. Maybe instead, for the enforcement piece, we can say, when you create this custom label, you can connect it to a project template, and that project template would have all of these settings, right? It would have merge request approval rules, it would have protected branches, it would have all of these like bits and bobs and levers and buttons you could push and pull and all that. And so when you apply the SOX label to a project that has inherited these standardized rules, it then overrides them with the project template that you're referencing, which maybe makes this a lot simpler from several facets, but then also uses an existing primitive of the project template feature to be able to connect those dots. And it saves us from having to pile on enforcement onto this already complicated inheritance model. But what do you think about that?
So I think if I understand you correctly, agnostic of labels, it'll just be a basic tree structure of you're inheriting from the thing above you. Although nothing is going into read-only mode, all your children can still go in and change things. If you don't want people to change things, you need to leverage, one, a compliance framework label, two, project templates to explicitly configure these things. So you won't necessarily be able to do it in UI. You need to have a fancy project template to be reused.
And so there's a couple of things there, right? We already know that customers are doing something like this because they call it compliance as code. But one of the things they do is they take sort of this project build file. I think it's maybe a JSON or YAML file, and they say compare this project to this file, and where things do not match, take some action. And so that's essentially what we could emulate on our backend natively, is whatever this project template specifies, that's our reference point. So when you apply a SOX label, we can check everything programmatically, or even just like restricted or whatever. Like we can build on top of that paradigm instead of having to build complexity into the default inheritance model. So that's one thing. The second is I think it aligns with this concept of configure once, but apply liberally, or as many times as you want. And so you would configure the one project template one time. And then if you decide, oh, I need to change that, you just go change the project template, and then we can figure out like, does that retroactively apply, or does it just allow for flexibility or whatever? But I'm wondering if that might be helpful in this case because we're separating the two, so we can tackle this inheritance problem for standardization automation, and then we can tackle the enforcement piece in a way that abstracts the two or like separates the two.
So yeah, no, I like the idea of using templates. I think I need to look more into how project templates work to better understand how they are consumed and reused. But I do really like the idea of focusing more on the logic layer of settings kind of in general. So push roles and protected branches would be included in this. Standardizing that behavior and then using the overrides as something that's driven by a broader template that can be pulled in. So in this example, I don't have it labeled because obviously I'm not ready for that since we're doing this on the fly.
Sure.
But if this was like our project down here, right? And so this is how our instance is configured today. It's all naked. Let's just assume this was a SOX project and it had a special one. So like if I made changes here and I set this to 2, this guy would have maybe just stayed at 0 if that's what the template was saying. If the template for whatever reason said number of required approvals would have been 0, it wouldn't change. But the group inherited it because the instance changed, and this project inherited it because the instance changed. And then if this group changes, nothing would have changed down here still. It's only pulling from its template. It can add on new things. Like it could add on an additional rule. Maybe even it could increase the number of required approvals just for this very unique circumstance, but it's not going to adopt everything else.
Yeah, and it follows the GitLab single source of truth philosophy, which is good, and I'm assuming more efficient. And then I had another thought. But...
So basically, this allow changes toggle isn't necessary because we wouldn't be dealing with, are you going to allow an override or not? We are inherently saying everything below you can be overwritten.
Correct.
Unless it has a compliance framework label that's using a specific project template to create its own protected rule set.
Yeah, and I think why I like that more as an additional point is that we're doing the exact same thing, except one of them has fewer steps or complexity. If we do the current paradigm we're exploring, yeah, we have this additional toggle, and and we only care about, you know, regulated projects beyond that, right? Like you can either toggle this thing and or then apply refinement of scope via the compliance labels. Whereas if we do this other thing we're exploring, you just apply the label to a project and it doesn't matter what the group rules are. It doesn't matter what the instance rules are. All that matters is that you've created the single source of truth and you are selectively applying it to n number of projects, and you only ever have to edit that one thing. Whereas even with this today, if you wanted to do enforcement, you'd have to go into like multiple groups or subgroups and like toggle these things, which can get very messy very quickly.
Yeah.
Whereas if we just do standardization and automation, it's a lot simpler and gives them a baseline to work from.
So I want to make sure I heard you correctly on this one. Are you saying you still think we would want to use an allow changes toggle? So even if it's outside of the scope of using a compliance framework label, we'd still want to give instance administrators or group owners the ability to turn on and off this thing, or no?
Oh, gotcha. No, I'm saying we would not, like you,
Okay.
I'm agreeing with you that we can get
Yeah.
rid of it. I
Got it.
think definitely
Yeah.
want to validate if this is like copacetic with our customer use cases. I think it would be an improvement over the current proposal. The one like, however, comma would be if I imagine there are organizations, like I know of one for sure that wants to apply a blanket policy across the board.
Right.
On one hand, you could say, okay, we'll just apply the label to every project because you can do it via API and it's easy enough. But the second is, well, maybe there is a use case we haven't thought about that makes sense where you apply the project labels to projects, but then every other project in the group or whatever, it's like you do want this mechanism. But I mean, this is derived from what customers have told us they want and us doing some validation. But I think now we're at the point where we're thinking like, okay, is this really the best way to solve it? And I think we're finding the answer is probably no. And here's a potential alternative that might solve the same problem, same outcome, just a lot easier to implement and in theory manage.
Okay. So contrasting this to push rules, if this was kind of how it looked today, ignore bottom project over here because this is our SOX project and it's a special child and does whatever it's told by its project template. If the instance administrator changes this to 4, the push rules logic today would say we don't push changes down.
Right.
Since these have deviated.
Projects.
Yeah, to existing, it's only to new. So I think that's one of the paradigms we would still be changing. I think is when you are at an instance or even at a group, like you're going to impact existing things. And I think there are other objects and settings that don't do that. I think that might be the biggest thing we need to work with across the board on is inherit or only applied to new things.
Yeah, and I think that, and I'm not convinced that that's necessarily the wrong default. Like, I think it's probably okay to default to only new objects, but there should be some action available to say, well, I want to retroactively apply this to everything, or at least to existing in that case, because all new ones would still inherit. And with the project template concept, you're essentially providing that option. When you apply the label to a new project, done. When you apply it to an existing one, I think we would necessarily have to prompt them with like, okay, this is going to change everything to match the project template. Are you sure? Because that could break things.
Yeah, and I think even the way that we're considering how it would work with push rules today, where we're saying like, okay, if you're in the compliance dashboard, you get a report of all these projects in this group that aren't matching your group rules. You can push that default to them. We realize that you may have set it, and that's going to affect all your new projects. But now you know for the 500 that already exists in your group, who's not matching it. You can decide whether or not they deserve or they should be at least updated. I'm not going to say enforced because sometimes it's just like an update. It's like, oh, we forgot to update these. They're not a regulated project, but we just want to swiftly make all of them have the number of approvers equal to.
So yeah, so for my clarity, you're saying that the premise or the mock-up where you showed the like keep or like use defaults versus keep custom, like that experience, you're saying this project template could make that easier or would support that?
I was saying like without having a project template to update the rules, how would I do it if it wasn't being inherited? So if it doesn't update based off of its parent, which is what we have to do
Okay.
with push rules, because it's not updating existing projects. So we have to give
I
a way to recursively apply those things, as we've said.
Yeah. Um, so ignoring the technical complexity of it or feasibility, I would assume that we could say, okay, when I create this template, I'm going to store it in such a manner that I can then poll against that for these projects. And then if it doesn't match, I'll click a button and it'll force that project to reference that template. And if it
Mm,
does match, then no action. Does that make sense?
okay, I see. You're saying instead of saying pull from the group, pull from the project template.
That's one option.
Yeah, yeah.
I think
I'm
if
just trying
I
to
think
clarify in
we,
my mind what you said.
yeah, and I think we can go either way, right? Like
Yeah.
if we just have to commit to one.
Yeah, right. I think that's the crux of what we're trying to figure out is what do we
Well, and that's the
converge on
thing.
here?
Yeah, and that's the thing too is like you projects have push rules at the project level, and so those could become part of that template mechanism with labels. And so maybe the group level implementations should only ever be standardize and automate and default only to new objects. And then if you want to retroactively apply things, maybe we just do that by means of adding a label rather than adding it at the group level. I don't know.
It would throw a wrench in what we currently have, but I think it might be the better idea. Because I mean, like if we diverging away from merge request approval rules, going over to push rules as the example.
Mm-hmm.
If I am in the GitLab org prod group and I have 500 projects, 3 of these just happen to have different push rules configured. Um, I have the choice to set to default. It is unclear what that means, but I think the intent was either to set to the default of whatever the push rules are set at the group level, or I think what you're saying is what we could do is maybe use the project template as the single source of truth for the rule set.
Right.
So
Um,
yeah.
yeah, I think I'm going to have to think about that a little bit more because I don't know if that necessarily makes the decision easier.
Yeah. I do think it makes it easier for enforcement. I think the project template idea is a great idea for the enforcement
Yeah.
and putting things into a read-only state. I like that a little bit more than just having to toggle on and off, allow changes.
Yeah.
Um, I like the idea of being able to set at the instance level and group level sensible defaults, and I'm leaning towards the reality of only applying to new projects. It just creates the conundrum of how do you update what's already there.
Okay. So let me lay this out as I think I understand it and what I think our options going forward are.
Okay.
So everything you said, I agree with. And so I think that gives us two concurrent solutions here. The group level push rules, we'll stay to that example for simplicity.
Mm-hmm.
We can define those at the group level, and it will standardize and automate the inheritance for new objects. Um, we could and probably should build in an action that allows you to apply it to existing objects with like a warning and that whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then simultaneously we have the labels mapped to project templates, which would be used for solely the enforcement piece, at least initially, and say, if I want this project to be different, here is a label that's tied to a template that's going to dictate the settings and the inability for people to change that. But then I think the projects may eventually also have some action to override existing project settings. Because I imagine that especially there, it'll be more common for people to say,
Right.
Oh, I have this ecosystem. I need to go create this new label for some reason, and it deviates from existing label project templates. So I'm going to create it, marry it to a new project template, and then apply that to this handful of projects that
Mm-hmm.
fit that criteria. And so it necessarily needs to update those settings. Otherwise, that feature doesn't make sense in that context.
Yes, I think I'm with you on all of that. now we have a lot of work for us to do to try and show how
Yeah.
that convergence shows up.
Yeah. So I
Oh
think
man. Yeah,
so okay, so I think for simplicity, we should just do like a really simple flow chart, like mermaid diagram, or if it's easier for
uh-huh.
you in Mural or Figma, like let's just do that. And then
Okay.
let's validate that with customers and say, look, you
Yeah.
want control of group level push rules, for example. So here's one implementation or one solution where we'll let you standardize and automate it. Here's how we think you should handle enforcement because this is much easier in the long run and takes very minimal setup. Um, and if we can validate that, I think that would be my vote as far as how we move forward, because it makes the current proposal a lot simpler, which
Hmm.
makes it a lot easier to implement, which means we can get it out sooner, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm trying to um, illustrate this a little bit, or at least get that diagram started.
Yeah, go for it.
One, I'm awful at mural because it's different than both Sketch and Figma, and I swear I keep hitting shortcuts, and it's like, ah, you open this drawer, and I'm like, no, what are you doing?
Yeah.
I just wanted to copy paste. Leave me alone. Oh man.
Yeah, and then unlike Tan, I do not think in mermaid diagram, so it takes me far too long to like build it there.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I definitely have to like draw on a piece of paper, and then I'm like, okay, now make a mermaid diagram that looks like this so it can be. And then I question, am I adding value? Should I just post this piece of paper that I have on my desk? 'Cause that's
Yeah,
probably
seriously.
more worthwhile than doing it all by myself.
Yeah, first iteration.
Yeah, exactly. I'll I can drop this in the chat in case you want to jump in here, but I only got like 5 more minutes. Does this change at all how we're going to approach the conversation with discussing oh, how is the meeting labeled? It is labeled discuss group level push rules and related roadmap items. So does this change how we want to approach the group level push rules?
Um, I think we should still present it as if this was the original solution, but I think we should then throw them the curveball and say, okay, but what do you think about this other thing that we've been thinking about as we assess some of the technical challenges of this implementation? And I say propose both and get their feedback side by side in that way.
I think the only thing is I'm not going to probably have this ready with you in 15 minutes, 20 minutes. We could try, but
Is it, when is it even?
it says 20 minutes on my calendar.
Oh yeah, 1 o'clock. For some reason I thought it was 12:45. Okay. I mean, if you have the next 20 open, we can just sit here and
Yeah,
hack away
I
at
do.
this.
I do.
Okay. Just kind of following along to see.
So I was trying to show like we basically have two areas. There's new and existing, and then there's also this project templates that people can configure for socks. I'm assuming we're thinking like, oh, you can go into a compliance label and specify to use this project template for the HIPAA label. See, I just want to click on this project note. And normally in Figma, I would hold command and click on it, and that would go straight to it. But
Oh, you
no,
just send this to the back.
yes. So that's what I'm saying. It's silly, but it's annoying.
Yeah.
I just forget, and then I end up rage clicking.
So I'm assuming this is going to go like this.
Yeah, it would be pulling from there. Into back. Maybe what makes more sense. Don't kill me for this. Just trying to show like the organization in like a flat hierarchy.
Yeah.
Um, Maybe it just makes more sense if I put all these in the same box.
Oh, that is an appropriate font size. just mostly notes for me, but also helpful context. Oh, this looks cool. It's like one of those like flight path maps.
We're very focused on socks, as you can tell.
Yeah.
So in the instance of push rules, what we're saying today in our designs and proposal is you can push down the group level defaults to your projects. But what we're saying is potentially like this guy could instead decide to pull from the socks related one. Wow, let's not do it like that. That was awful. Copy this, paste it, and link here, I'll link here. So we're saying like potentially this guy can say use template. Where'd the word group go? That's how I understood what you were saying earlier.
So I don't think the group one is necessary.
Okay.
Like I think basically what happens is we'll start from the top level. At the instance level, we define push rules.
Mm-hmm.
Those get inherited by new objects.
Mm-hmm.
We add in functionality that would allow someone to apply the instance level push rules to
Mm-hmm.
existing objects. But then projects that get created, whether they're new or existing, can have a socks label or any custom label applied. In this case, the socks label maps to a socks project template.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's existing and the label gets applied, we prompt them to say, hey, this is going to change it to this template's settings and configuration. Are you okay? And if it's a new project that gets created with the socks label, then it just says this will be created with this template or something. I think the only difference between new and existing is that one, you're having to prompt them for UX to say, this is about to change. It will probably break stuff. But I don't think we need anything at the group level other than the ability to define the standard rules, but just no enforcement mechanism.
So if I'm an administrator and I want to push changes, the way I could do that is by going into a group, going to their compliance dashboard, and saying, like what's a fun? There, this is fun. Some sort of button that's like use the instance defaults to pull it down.
The one thing we'll need to explore in particular is whether or not there is a use case to apply them for a group. But I'm assuming that by applying these labels to the projects, you don't need also the group level unless you're wanting to apply everything equally across every project in a group. But in that case, I think the labels still work because you could just apply the label to every project and you could do it maybe via API instead of by hand if you have thousands of projects or something. But
Yeah.
that's going to be the dynamic where we're just going to have to figure out if that use case is supported here and if that use case even exists if we're solving this at the project level.
And then the same logic would exist though for like groups going to subgroups. So if I have an instance, it's set up, I created a new group, I inherited things from it, and I adjust my group settings, and I create a subgroup, then that subgroup is going to inherit its group's design, not the instance design. And then
I think that's okay.
Yeah. And then if I create a project, that project will inherit its subgroups settings.
Correct.
Unless I use a compliance framework label, which will then point to a project template that it will use instead. And that will not be able to be changed.
Correct. Yeah, so that would have to be like a group owner and probably admin type of thing.
Yeah.
Like project maintainers cannot have control over that. We already know that much.
Although they have control over it today, technically, if they can add and remove the label, but that's a problem for a different day. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So I'm on my screen now. But so that still allows this design to work. We would just be specifying that you can pull from your instance if you want to set a default to a project. So it gives you some, but I mean, this isn't pulling the group. Sorry. This design is for pushing to a project as opposed to updating the group level.
Correct.
So we don't have anything technically today that would allow the pulling of the instance into the group level for an existing project, or sorry, for an existing group.
Yeah. And maybe that's okay. I think we just have to validate it because usually they want to standardize it at the group level so that it's standardized at the project level is what I interpret from that.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest problem to solve first. I hear less people from my limited exposure talk about instance and talk a lot more about groups. And it's probably because that's where they have more permissions because not everybody's given the access to the admin area. So to me, it sounds like for Cameron, they'd be more concerned about, okay, yeah, I have all these existing projects. I've updated my rule set. It looks great. But maybe I don't want to use a compliance framework template to enforce these rules. I just want to help create sensible defaults. Let me update all those. Okay.
So yeah, so what we're looking at here on Mural, this is the combined proposal of what we're talking about, right? Where we can both talk about.
It is, yeah, I think so. Okay. I think we can pitch it in a way that makes sense across push rules, merge request approvals. I would have to double check protected branches because I just don't remember those as well.
Well, so here's what I think we should present to the customer. I think we should go through the issue as it stands today for the push rules and just talk about that. And then we'll switch gears after a little bit of discussion and say, okay, now here's an alternative solution that we'd like your feedback on. Everything we just said, minus the enforcement, but instead we're going to handle the enforcement through this project template mechanism, and then we can dive in there. Because I think showing them just this won't be as helpful as seeing all of your hard work and the actual prototypes for the current thinking. And then we can leverage this simpler diagram for the new pivot.
Yes, although I think they can both coexist.
Okay.
So in this example, I'm this group and I have existing settings and I've got these. Oh, this is tricky. Okay. Okay. I have an existing group and I created a new project. Who did I get my rules from?
You would get it from the group. Yeah.
Okay. So that's already existing. Okay. So if I'm this group and there's already an existing project, we have differing rules. And I want to push a rule, but I don't want to use a project template. That would be a place when you'd want to use the compliance dashboard as we showed here, set to the default.
Yeah, and like maybe that's what we can. So like the whole instance level argument, I think, is at least partially, if not wholly, solved by this project template thing, because what they want is that control at the instance level. Well, at the instance level, you create your like secret, powerful top level group or project or whatever, and you like create these templates in there. Or well, sorry, you create your single source of truth group, and then you create the project templates in there. And so let's say you have the two projects. Well, you're controlling that as admins. You only grant permission to that group to whomever you want. And then by adding the labels, you're able to then apply those projects and those settings wherever you want. And so we inherently handle the reduction of scope as well. And then I question whether or not they actually need any sort of set to default.
They even need this at all. Yeah.
Yeah. Which maybe, but
maybe not. But maybe. Fingers crossed, maybe.
Yeah, fingers crossed. So where did we land then on, do we want to show current mock-ups and then this diagram, or just use this one and talk to both? Or what do you want to do?
Have they already seen the issue? Like, is that what spurred the conversation?
I honestly don't recall. I want to say maybe. I would say let's just assume they've seen the issue
Mhm.
because it seems like it's been an ongoing conversation, um, and we'll operate off of that.
Okay, then maybe it is worthwhile at least to touch on the issue, just in case they have, just so they're not like, what is this thing you're talking about over here? You have work that's in your flow already. We could talk about how that, and I say we, I assume you're presenting the idea. Talk about how this is currently solving a problem given how GitLab works today. But then we could also touch on the fact that there's a broader initiative to improve the settings UX overall, including things related to like the inheritance model. This is how we're considering evolving over time. And then we, if it makes sense, we could work through this mural board a bit with them to talk through some of that logic.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll start the conversation and I'll ask them if they want us to go into the deeper technical dive. And if they do, then I'll hand it over to you to walk through your mock-ups that you had where it was like using the socks label versus not, or whatever you feel is appropriate to demonstrate that. But then I would probably then
Mm.
walk them through this rationale. So we have the side by side.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would probably end up bringing up is just the group level stuff. I don't think that this step through prototype makes sense the way that it
Okay.
stands today, and it would just add more confusion. The only thing I would be totally open to helping you with is clarifying the issue, its mock-ups for the proposal, and talking through our diagram if they want to get into the nitty gritty of how we see things evolving. But I would love a data point on if they think this makes sense to them.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah,
With that,
it'll
I owe
it'll
you
be
a
a bit of a
beer.
mess. It's going to be a little bit of a hot mess on the call just because